Night. February 26, 1991. The Iraqi desert, 70 kilometers west of Basra. Captain Rashid al-Hamdani sits cramped inside the commander's cupola of his T-72M. Turret hatches sealed against the sandstorm that has turned the world outside into a howling void of darkness and grit. The Republican Guard's Tawakalna division has dug in along what intelligence claims is the coalition's likely axis of advance. But intelligence, like everything else in this war, has proven worse than useless. Al-Hamdani's gunner, crouched below him in the turret basket, reports nothing through the TPD-K1 optical sight. Blackness. The sandstorm has devoured the stars, the horizon, any reference point that might separate Earth from sky. The only light comes from the dim red glow of the turret's interior lamps, casting the gunner's face in shadows that make him look already dead. "Commander, I cannot see." The gunner's voice carries the tremor that has infected the entire brigade since the air war began 5 weeks ago. They have watched the sky rain fire every night. They have counted the burning wrecks of tanks that died without firing a shot. And now, somewhere in that absolute darkness, the Americans are coming. Al-Hamdani knows the procedure. He has drilled it 1,000 times in training at Taji. To engage at night, the gunner must activate the TPN-14923 infrared searchlight mounted on the left side of the main gun. The invisible beam will illuminate the battlefield, and through his infrared scope, the gunner will see what the naked eye cannot. Simple, effective, proven technology from the Soviet Union's vast arsenal. But there is a problem that no Soviet instructor ever mentioned, a flaw so fundamental that it transforms doctrine into suicide. The infrared searchlight is invisible to the human eye, but to anyone equipped with modern night vision goggles, to anyone whose tank features passive thermal imaging systems, that searchlight beam becomes a screaming advertisement of position, a luminous arrow pointing directly at the T-72's turret. Turning it on is not reconnaissance. It is self-immolation. The last thing thousands of Iraqi tank crews saw wasn't the enemy. It was nothing. Absolute darkness. And then, fire. The Gulf War wasn't just a military victory. It was a technological massacre that exposed a 20-year gap in night fighting capability. While Soviet export tanks fought blind in the dark, American thermal optics turned night into day. This asymmetry didn't just win battles. It redefined armored warfare doctrine globally and shattered the myth of Soviet tank superiority built over 4 decades of Cold War competition. This is the story of how technology created predator-prey dynamics on the modern battlefield, how Iraqi tankers experienced sensory deprivation warfare, and why the M1 Abrams thermal vision system represented not just an advantage, but a paradigm shift that rendered an entire generation of Soviet armored doctrine obsolete before the first shot was fired. The T-72M that Captain al-Hamdani commanded represented the twilight of a technological era, the last generation of armored vehicles designed to fight a war that no longer existed. Introduced as an export variant of the Soviet T-72A, the T-72M carried all the compromises inherent in equipment Moscow sold to client states: downgraded armor, simplified fire control, and, most critically, night vision systems frozen in a 1960s paradigm that assumed the enemy would be equally blind. The TPN-14923 infrared searchlight system, mounted alongside the 125mm main gun, operated on a principle of active illumination. The tank carried an infrared projector, essentially a powerful lamp that emitted light in wavelengths just beyond human visual perception, centered around 800 nanometers. When activated, this searchlight flooded the battlefield with infrared radiation. The gunner, peering through a specially designed infrared scope, could then see this reflected light, transforming the night into a greenish tableau of ghostly shapes and shadows. In theory, this system granted night fighting capability. In practice, it granted a death sentence. The fatal flaw was not in the physics but in the assumption underlying the design. Soviet engineers had built the system presuming symmetry, a battlefield where both sides employed similar technology. If everyone used infrared searchlights, then everyone revealed their position simultaneously. The advantage went to whoever fired first, to superior training and gunnery skills. It was tank combat transposed into darkness, retaining the same dynamics as daylight engagements. But by 1991, That assumption had become catastrophically obsolete. To anyone equipped with second-generation or third-generation passive night vision devices, an activated infrared searchlight appeared as a blazing beacon of light. American troops wearing ANPVS-7 night vision goggles could see the IR beam as clearly as a spotlight cutting through fog. More importantly, American tanks equipped with passive thermal imaging systems didn't need the Iraqis to turn on their searchlights at all. But when they did, when doctrine and desperation forced Iraqi gunners to activate that fatal lamp, it transformed the hunt into an execution. Imagine hunting in a forest at midnight. You carry a flashlight because you cannot see in the dark. Your prey, however, has evolved perfect night vision. Every time you switch on your flashlight to scan for targets, you announce your exact position to an enemy that has been watching you all along, seeing you clearly through the darkness that blinds you. This was the technological nightmare Iraqi armor faced in February 1991. The effective range of the TPN-1 system under optimal conditions reached perhaps 1,000 meters, though visibility degraded sharply in the dust and smoke that characterized the Kuwaiti battlefield. Beyond that range, Iraqi gunners stared into empty darkness, their scopes useless, their main guns silent. They were World War II tankers trapped in a late 20th century conflict, their doctrine and equipment a generational mismatch against an enemy that had already crossed into the future. While Iraqi tankers peered through obsolete optics into blackness, American M1A1 Abrams crews inhabited a different perceptual reality. They saw the battlefield not through reflected light, but through emitted heat, a fundamental shift in sensing technology that granted what intelligence analysts would later describe as categorical dominance in conditions of limited visibility. The Hughes aircraft ANVSG-2 thermal imaging system, mounted in the Abrams gunner's primary sight, operated on principles of passive detection. It required no searchlight, no active emission that might betray position. Instead, it detected infrared radiation in the far infrared spectrum, wavelengths between 8 and 12 micrometers, where all objects with temperatures above absolute zero emit thermal energy. The hotter an object, the more it glows in the thermal spectrum. The physics of desert warfare made this technology devastatingly effective. During the day, the Iraqi desert absorbed solar radiation, heating sand and metal alike until temperature differentials flattened into near uniformity. Thermal imaging retained its advantage, but the contrast diminished. At night, however, the desert transformed into a thermal hunter's paradise. Air temperatures plummeted to 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. The sand cooled rapidly, radiating away the day's accumulated heat into the clear sky. But tanks, their engines running, their hulls retaining warmth, their metal surfaces still hot from mechanical friction and crew presence, glowed against the frigid background like Christmas ornaments hung on an invisible tree. American gunners reported being able to identify specific tank models at 3,000 meters, to count individual crew members dismounting from vehicles, to track muzzle flashes through sandstorms thick enough to reduce visible light to zero. The thermal image converted heat signatures into a video display of white-hot targets against black-cold backgrounds, a battlefield rendered in stark contrast where Iraqi armor could not hide. The effective detection range of the M1A1's thermal system exceeded 3,000 meters under favorable conditions. Even in the worst sandstorms, even when visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in the visible spectrum, thermal imaging penetrated the airborne dust and rendered the battlefield transparent. Iraqi tanks at 800 meters, invisible to any optical system, appeared clearly on American thermal displays. The Americans could see through weather, through smoke, through the darkness itself. But range was only half the equation. The other half was speed. The M1A1's fire control system integrated the thermal sight with a laser rangefinder and a ballistic computer that calculated firing solutions automatically. The gunner placed the crosshairs on a target. The laser measured distance. The computer adjusted for range, ammunition type, wind, and the tank's own motion. The 120mm M256 smoothbore gun elevated to the precise angle. From target acquisition to trigger pull, the entire sequence consumed less than 8 seconds. First-round hit probability against stationary targets exceeded 90%. The Iraqis, even if they could see the Americans, even if they activated their suicidal searchlights and somehow survived long enough to aim, relied on manual range estimation and mechanical fire control. Their hit probability at maximum effective range barely reached 30% under ideal conditions. This was not combat. This was one side hunting while the other stumbled blind through a killing ground. Sensory organs severed. Tactical doctrine reduced to prayer. For Captain al-Hamdani and the thousands of Iraqi tankers deployed across Kuwait and southern Iraq, the Gulf War's ground campaign was an experience of disembodied terror, of dying without ever seeing the source of death. Post-war interviews with Iraqi prisoners of war, conducted by American intelligence officers and later analyzed by Soviet military attachés desperately seeking lessons from the debacle, revealed a consistent psychological pattern: the overwhelming sensation of fighting ghosts, of combat occurring in a dimension the Iraqis could not access. One Republican Guard tank commander, captured after the Battle of Norfolk, described the experience with haunting simplicity. "We heard explosions. We saw flashes when our tanks died, but we never saw them. We never saw the Americans. It was like fighting jinn, invisible spirits from Islamic mythology." The metaphor captured precisely the sensory void Iraqi crews inhabited, a battlefield where cause and effect had been severed, where death arrived from an unseeable direction at an unknowable distance. The tactical dilemma paralyzed Iraqi armor doctrine. If they kept their infrared searchlights off, they remained blind, unable to detect American forces until sabot rounds tore through their hulls at 1,700 meters per second. If they activated the searchlights, they transformed themselves into backlit targets for an enemy that had been tracking them through thermal optics for minutes, waiting for the perfect shot. Brigade commanders radioed desperate orders to advance, to maneuver, to establish firing positions. But maneuver requires navigation, and navigation requires visual reference points. In the sandstorms that swept across Kuwait during late February, sandstorms that reduced visibility to near zero, Iraqi units became disoriented, their formations fragmenting into isolated vehicles wandering blind through a landscape devoid of landmarks. GPS navigation systems, standard in American vehicles, did not exist in T-72 export models. Iraqi navigators relied on maps, compasses, and terrain recognition. When the terrain disappeared into blowing sand, when the stars vanished behind dust clouds, units lost cohesion. The Americans, guided by GPS and seeing clearly through thermal optics, maintained perfect formation and situational awareness. The Battle of Norfolk, fought on the night of February 27, 1991, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of this sensory asymmetry. The Iraqi 18th Mechanized Brigade, dug into defensive positions south of the Makwa Gap, found itself engaged by elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. The battle commenced during a sandstorm shortly after midnight. Iraqi defenders heard the rumble of approaching armor but saw nothing. They fired illumination rounds, desperate for any visual reference. The flares revealed only swirling sand. Then the killing began. American tanks, positioned at ranges between 1,500 and 2,500 meters, began systematic engagement of Iraqi armor. The thermal sights rendered Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carriers as perfect targets despite the sandstorm. Iraqi crews, blind, attempted to return fire in the general direction of muzzle flashes. Most never located a target. Many activated their infrared searchlights in final desperation, achieving a few seconds of grainy visibility before sabot rounds or heat projectiles struck their vehicles. The engagement lasted approximately 2 hours. American forces destroyed over 300 Iraqi armored vehicles. U.S. casualties, 0 tanks lost to enemy fire. Iraqi survivors described the battle not as combat, but as systematic execution, a mechanical process of being destroyed one by an enemy that never materialized from the darkness. One captured Iraqi officer, a battalion commander whose entire unit was annihilated at Norfolk, later told American interrogators, "We were animals being hunted. We could hear the predator. We could smell the smoke from its kills, but we could not see it, and we had no way to fight back." The psychological effect transcended tactical defeat. It activated something primal, an ancient fear of predation coded into human neurology, the terror of being prey to an unseen hunter. This was the reality Iraqi tankers inhabited during the 100 hours of ground combat. a sensory void punctuated by sudden annihilation, a war fought from inside a black box, while an enemy they could not perceive destroyed them with industrial efficiency. In Moscow, the reports arriving from military advisors embedded with Iraqi forces triggered what GRU analysts later described as controlled disbelief. The casualty figures seemed impossible, the engagement ratios mathematically absurd. Soviet military doctrine, built on decades of armor theory and tested in conflicts from Kursk to Afghanistan, did not accommodate the scenarios unfolding in Kuwait. By early March 1991, as the ceasefire took hold and Iraqi units surrendered en masse, the scope of the armored catastrophe became undeniable. Coalition forces had destroyed over 2,000 Iraqi tanks during the ground campaign. Iraqi forces had destroyed, by the most generous estimates, 0 American M1 Abrams tanks in tank-on-tank combat. 9 M1s had been lost total during the war. 7 were destroyed by friendly fire in the chaos of night maneuvers. 2 succumbed to non-combat mechanical failures. Not a single M1 had been penetrated by Iraqi main gunfire. For Soviet military intelligence, this data was not merely concerning. It was existential. The GRU established a priority assessment committee tasked with determining how American armor had achieved such categorical dominance, particularly during night and limited visibility conditions. The investigation proceeded with the same urgency that had characterized the Soviet response to American stealth aircraft, demonstrated during the same conflict. Both assessments revealed technological gaps, but the armor question carried a different strategic weight. Stealth aircraft were exotic, expensive, limited in number. They threatened Soviet air defenses, but did not invalidate core doctrine. The M1 Abrams, however, represented something more fundamental. Mass-produced conventional armor that dominated Soviet equipment so thoroughly that numerical superiority had become irrelevant. If the Americans could achieve 100-to-1 kill ratios in armored combat, then the entire Soviet doctrine of overwhelming NATO through numerical advantage in tanks collapsed into fantasy. The GRU assessment, portions of which were declassified after the Soviet Union's dissolution, traced the dominance to a single technological system: passive thermal imaging. Soviet intelligence had been aware of American thermal development programs since the late 1970s. Hughes Aircraft's work on the ANVSG-2 was not secret. The system's existence had been noted in defense journals and congressional testimony, but Soviet analysts had underestimated the maturity of the technology and, more critically, had failed to appreciate the scale of American deployment. The M1A1 Abrams had entered service in 1985. By 1991, the U.S. Army had fielded over 4,000 thermal-equipped M1A1 tanks. Every frontline American armored vehicle possessed night-fighting capability that exceeded anything in the Soviet inventory. The Americans had not developed a prototype or equipped elite units. They had industrialized thermal imaging and distributed it across the entire force structure. The Soviets, meanwhile, had pursued thermal imaging research through programs like the Buran experimental system and had equipped limited numbers of command variants like the T-80UK with primitive thermal sights. But budgetary constraints, manufacturing challenges, and competing priorities meant thermal systems never transitioned to mass production. Export variants like the T-72M, the tank that constituted the bulk of Iraqi armor, remained locked in 1960s active infrared technology. The GRU report concluded with bureaucratic understatement that the Americans had achieved categorical dominance in conditions of limited visibility, and that current Soviet thermal imaging programs require acceleration and resource priority to address capability gap. In practical terms, this meant the Soviets acknowledged they had lost the night, and they lacked the economic capacity to close the gap. The Soviet Union had built its military doctrine on the assumption of rough technological parity, where superior numbers and operational art could overcome marginal American advantages. The Gulf War shattered that assumption. The Americans did not have a marginal advantage. They had leapfrogged an entire generation of sensor technology, and the Soviets could not afford to follow. This silent panic rippling through Moscow's military establishment in spring 1991 mirrored the shock of the F-117 stealth revelation. Together, they painted a picture of comprehensive technological defeat, of a superpower whose vast military machine had been rendered obsolete Not through attrition, but through innovation it could neither match nor counter. The dominance of thermal imaging over active infrared illumination rested on fundamental physics that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome. Understanding why one technology crushed the other requires examining how each system interacted with electromagnetic radiation and the environment. Active infrared systems, like the TPN-1 mounted on Iraqi T-72s, functioned as artificial light sources. The infrared searchlight emitted photons at wavelengths around 800 nanometers, just beyond the visible red spectrum. These photons traveled outward, struck objects in the environment, and reflected back toward the tank. The gunner's infrared scope, sensitive to those specific wavelengths, detected the reflected photons and converted them into a visible image. This approach suffered from three critical limitations. First, active systems announced the observer's position. Any sensor capable of detecting near-infrared radiation could see the searchlight beam. American night vision goggles, operating through image intensification of ambient light including near-infrared, rendered Iraqi searchlight beams as obvious as lighthouse beacons. The moment an Iraqi gunner activated the searchlight, every American soldier within line of sight knew the T-72's precise location. Second, active infrared required clear line of sight. The emitted photons had to travel to the target and reflect back. Any obscuration, smoke, dust, or precipitation scattered the infrared beam just as it would visible light. During sandstorms, the TPN-1 system became nearly useless, its effective range collapsing to a few hundred meters as airborne particles scattered the infrared illumination into diffuse glow. Third, the system's effective range was limited by the power of the infrared lamp and the sensitivity of the receiving scope. Iraqi searchlights achieved useful illumination to perhaps 1,000 meters under optimal conditions. Beyond that range, the returned signal became too weak to form useful images. Thermal imaging operated on entirely different principles, exploiting radiation that all objects emit, rather than photons they reflect. Every object with a temperature above absolute zero emits electromagnetic radiation across a spectrum of wavelengths. The hotter the object, the more intense the emission, and the shorter the peak wavelength. This is why heated metal glows red, then white as temperature increases. But even relatively cool objects emit radiation in the far infrared spectrum, wavelengths between 8 and 12 micrometers, far longer than the near-infrared used by active illumination systems. The M1A1's ANVSG-2 thermal imager contained a scanning mechanism that swept across the battlefield, collecting far infrared radiation from the scene. This radiation passed through germanium optics, was focused onto an array of detectors cooled to cryogenic temperatures to enhance sensitivity, and converted into an electrical signal. The signal was processed and displayed as a video image where hotter objects appeared bright and cooler objects appeared dark. This passive detection offered overwhelming advantages. Because thermal imaging detected emitted rather than reflected radiation, it required no active illumination. The M1A1 remained electronically silent in the infrared spectrum. There was no searchlight beam to betray position, no telltale emission that announced the observer's presence. American tanks hunted invisibly, their sensors drinking in thermal radiation while emitting nothing. Thermal imaging also penetrated obscurance that defeated visible and near-infrared systems. Sandstorms, the pervasive environmental factor during the Gulf War ground campaign, scattered shorter wavelengths but allowed far infrared radiation to pass with minimal attenuation. American thermal sights saw through sand and dust that rendered Iraqi optics completely blind. Smoke from burning oil wells, thick enough to turn day into twilight, barely degraded thermal imaging performance. Most critically, the desert thermal environment created maximum contrast for American sensors. At night, air temperatures dropped to 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. The sand, an excellent radiator, shed heat rapidly and cooled to match ambient temperatures. But tanks, their engines idling, their mechanical systems generating friction heat, their steel hulls retaining thermal energy, maintained temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees Celsius. This 50 to 70 degree differential appeared on thermal displays as stark white targets against black backgrounds. American gunners described Iraqi tanks as glowing ornaments, so thermally distinct from the background that target identification became trivial even at maximum sensor range. One M1A1 gunner from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, interviewed after the Battle of 73 Easting, stated, "They looked like Christmas trees, bright white shapes on black ground. You could count hatches and identify models. It wasn't combat, it was target shooting." The effective detection range of the M1A1 thermal system exceeded 3,000 meters, triple the effective range of Iraqi active infrared under ideal conditions, and 10 times the range during obscured conditions. American tanks could detect, identify, and engage Iraqi armor long before Iraqi crews even knew American forces were present. The generational gap between active infrared and thermal imaging was not incremental, it was categorical. One technology provided marginal night capability under restricted conditions. The other provided complete environmental transparency, transforming night and obscured conditions into a hunter's advantage rather than a tactical limitation. The difference between hunting with a flashlight that reveals your position and hunting with night vision that makes you invisible was the difference between life and death on the Kuwaiti battlefield. The quantifiable results of this technological asymmetry transformed the Gulf War's armored engagements from combat into statistical annihilation. Battlefield performance so one-sided that it seemed to belong to simulation rather than reality. Coalition armored forces destroyed more than 2,000 Iraqi tanks during the 100 hours of ground operations. The M1 Abrams, the primary American main battle tank, accounted for the majority of these kills. In return, Iraqi forces destroyed exactly 0 M1 Abrams tanks through direct fire in tank versus tank combat. The kill-loss ratio was not measurable in conventional terms because the denominator was 0. The 9 M1 tanks lost during the war tell their own story of the Gulf incapability. 7 were destroyed by friendly fire, American rounds striking American armor in the chaos of night maneuvers where thermal optics and GPS navigation granted perfect awareness of enemy positions, but imperfect identification of friendly forces amid swirling combat. 2 M1s were lost to non-combat causes, mechanical failures in the demanding desert environment. None were destroyed by Iraqi main gunfire. Iraqi gunners scored hits on American armor, rounds striking at oblique angles or against reactive armor panels. But not a single Iraqi projectile achieved penetrating kill of an M1 Abrams. The dominance became even more pronounced when isolating night and limited visibility engagements, the conditions where thermal imaging granted maximum advantage. American commanders, recognizing their overwhelming sensor superiority, deliberately scheduled major armored assaults during hours of darkness or periods of reduced visibility. Approximately 60% of coalition armor kills occurred during night operations or sandstorms, precisely the conditions where Iraqi forces operated blind. The Americans had identified their technological edge and weaponized it, transforming environmental challenges into tactical advantages. The Battle of 73 Easting, fought on the afternoon and evening of February 26, 1991, demonstrated this dynamic with surgical clarity. Elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, conducting a reconnaissance screen, encountered dug-in elements of the Iraqi Tawakalna Republican Guard Division during a sandstorm. Visibility in the visible spectrum dropped to less than 100 meters. Iraqi defenders, positioned in prepared fighting positions with fields of fire carefully plotted, could not see the approaching Americans through the blowing sand. The Americans, seeing clearly through thermal optics, identified over 160 Iraqi armored vehicles, including T-72 tanks and BMP infantry fighting vehicles. The engagement began at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, Iraqi armor appearing as bright thermal signatures against the cold desert floor. American tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles commenced systematic engagement, firing on the move with GPS-aided navigation, maintaining perfect formation despite 0 visual references. The battle lasted 23 minutes. American forces destroyed 160 Iraqi armored vehicles, along with additional trucks, anti-aircraft systems, and infantry positions. 2 American Bradley fighting vehicles were destroyed, both by Iraqi anti-tank missiles fired at point-blank range during the close-in fighting after the main armor engagement. No American tanks were lost. Iraqi crews, interviewed after capture, reported never seeing American armor until M1 tanks drove past their destroyed positions during the consolidation phase. The Battle of Medina Ridge, fought the following day on February 27th, provided even more dramatic statistics. The U.S. 1st Armored Division engaged elements of the Iraqi Medina Republican Guard Division during evening hours. As visibility degraded, over a 2-hour period, American forces destroyed 186 Iraqi tanks, primarily T-72s, along with dozens of other armored vehicles. The Americans suffered 0 tank losses to enemy action. One M1 was struck by Iraqi fire, but the round failed to penetrate. The crew reported the impact, continued fighting, and destroyed 3 additional Iraqi tanks before withdrawing for damage assessment. First shot hit probability data revealed the technical underpinnings of this dominance. American M1A1 gunners, using thermal sights integrated with laser rangefinders and ballistic computers, achieved first-round hit rates exceeding 90% against stationary targets at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. Iraqi T-72 crews, relying on optical sights and manual range estimation during daylight or suicidal active infrared at night, achieved estimated first-round hit rates below 40%, even under ideal conditions. When Iraqi crews did achieve hits on American armor, their ammunition often proved inadequate. The T-72M's primary armor-piercing round, the 3BM-15 steel penetrator, could not reliably penetrate M1A1 frontal armor even at close range. American 120mm M829 depleted uranium penetrators, by contrast, punched through T-72 armor at any engagement range with devastating effect. The combination of superior sensors, superior fire control, superior protection, and superior ammunition created a capability gap so extreme that numerical superiority became irrelevant. Iraqi Republican Guard divisions, fielding hundreds of tanks and dug into prepared positions, were destroyed piecemeal by American armored units that sometimes operated at numerical disadvantage, but enjoyed categorical technological superiority. This was not the tank warfare of World War II, or even the Arab-Israeli conflicts of the 1970s, where skill and tactics and positioning could overcome equipment deficiencies. This was industrial-scale destruction enabled by sensory monopoly, one side seeing perfectly, while the other fought blind. The numbers did not describe combat. They described a massacre executed with methodical efficiency by an enemy that inhabited a different perceptual dimension. The Gulf War's armored engagements annihilated more than Iraqi tanks. They destroyed Soviet military doctrine, the intellectual framework that had guided the Red Army's development for half a century. Soviet armor doctrine, refined through decades of theoretical work and validated in the crucible of World War II, rested on a foundational assumption: massed tank formations, properly employed with artillery support and operational maneuver, could overwhelm technologically superior opponents through numerical superiority and aggressive action. The doctrine acknowledged that NATO forces might field better individual platforms, but Soviet planners believed the Red Army's vast tank production and sophisticated operational art would compensate. The entire concept assumed rough parity in fundamental capabilities. Both sides could see the battlefield. Both sides could navigate and communicate. Both sides could engage targets at comparable ranges. Numerical advantage and superior operational execution would decide the outcome. The Gulf War revealed this assumption to be catastrophically wrong. Iraqi forces in Kuwait fielded approximately 4,000 tanks, more armor than coalition ground forces initially deployed to the theater. By Soviet doctrinal standards, this numerical advantage, combined with defensive positions and interior lines, should have enabled effective resistance even against technologically superior attackers. Soviet planners, analyzing pre-war force ratios, predicted coalition ground operations would require weeks of sustained combat and produce significant casualties. The actual campaign lasted 100 hours and produced the most one-sided armored victory in modern military history. The failure was not tactical. Iraqi units, particularly Republican Guard divisions, executed defensive doctrine reasonably well. They dug in tanks hull down, created overlapping fields of fire, positioned anti-tank systems in depth. Soviet military advisors observed Iraqi defensive preparations and found them adequate, if not exemplary. The failure was perceptual. Iraqi forces could not see the battlefield at night or during obscured conditions. Without thermal imaging, without GPS navigation, without the sensor suite that granted Americans complete environmental awareness, Iraqi numerical advantage became meaningless. Units lost cohesion in sandstorms. Formations fragmented. Individual tanks were destroyed one by an enemy they never saw. For Soviet military theorists, the implications were devastating. If the Americans could achieve 100-to-1 kill ratios against numerically superior forces employing sound defensive doctrine, then the entire premise of Soviet war planning collapsed. The Red Army's vast tank fleets, the armored divisions positioned across Eastern Europe, the operational concepts of deep battle and echelon warfare, all assumed that Soviet numerical advantage could overwhelm NATO's qualitative edge. The Gulf War suggested otherwise. It suggested that sensor dominance and information superiority could neutralize numerical advantage so completely that force ratios became irrelevant. In scenarios where one side saw clearly and the other fought blind, numbers did not matter. The side with information monopoly would systematically destroy the side lacking sensors, kill ratios limited only by ammunition expenditure and time available for engagement. Soviet planners had long war-gamed scenarios of NATO-Warsaw Pact conflict. These simulations generally assumed 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 numerical advantages would enable Soviet forces to break through NATO lines, despite American technological advantages. The Gulf War demonstrated that even greater numerical superiority meant nothing if the technological gap extended to the sensory dimension. You cannot employ tanks, you cannot navigate. Against enemies you cannot detect. At ranges you cannot reach. The lesson echoed across military establishments worldwide. Within 2 years of the Gulf War's conclusion, every major military initiated or accelerated thermal imaging procurement programs. The French upgraded their Leclerc tanks with Sagem thermal sights. The British accelerated thermal integration into Challenger 2. The Germans expanded thermal deployment across Leopard 2 fleets. The Chinese began indigenous thermal development programs and purchased systems from Western suppliers. Tank procurement philosophy shifted fundamentally. Pre-Gulf War, military planners evaluated tanks primarily on firepower, protection, and mobility. Post-Gulf War, sensor capability became the dominant factor. A tank that could not see in all conditions, that lacked integrated thermal imaging and digital fire control, was considered obsolete regardless of its armor thickness or gun caliber. The Soviet Union, even before its formal dissolution in December 1991, faced an unbridgeable gap. Retrofitting thermal imaging systems to the tens of thousands of tanks in Soviet inventory would have cost hundreds of billions of rubles that the collapsing economy could not provide. Even if funding materialized, Soviet manufacturing capacity could not produce thermal sensors at the scale required to match American deployment. The doctrine that had sustained Soviet military planning since 1945, that numerical superiority and operational excellence could overcome technological disadvantage, died in the Kuwaiti desert alongside the Iraqi tanks it was supposed to protect. In modern armored warfare, information dominance beat numerical superiority. You could not kill what you could not see, and you could not survive if the enemy saw you first, always, under all conditions. The M1 Abrams' invisible dominance in the Gulf War did not end with ceasefire. It echoed forward through decades of military development and reappeared with haunting similarity in conflicts that followed, a recurring pattern of thermal asymmetry deciding armored engagements before the first shot. The Soviet Union's dissolution in December 1991 occurred less than 10 months after the Gulf War's conclusion. The correlation was not coincidental. The comprehensive technological defeat demonstrated in Iraq, combined with the simultaneous revelation of American stealth aircraft dominance, accelerated the Soviet military establishment's acceptance of irreversible strategic lag. The economic resources required to close the gap in stealth technology, thermal imaging, precision weapons, and information systems exceeded what the failing Soviet economy could possibly generate. The military, recognizing it could no longer defend the superpower status that justified the Communist Party's monopoly on power, withdrew its support. The August 1991 coup attempt failed. The Union dissolved. Russia inherited the Soviet military's technological debt. Modern Russian main battle tanks, the T-90M and the experimental T-14 Armata, now feature indigenous thermal imaging systems. But the 30-year gap remains visible in the composition of Russian armored forces, where thousands of legacy T-72 and T-80 variants, many lacking advanced thermal sights, constitute the bulk of deployable armor. This gap manifested with grim symmetry during Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, equipped with Western thermal imaging systems including American-supplied M2 Bradley fighting vehicles and British thermal sights, alongside thermal-equipped anti-tank guided missiles like Javelin, recreated elements of the Gulf War's predator-prey dynamic. Russian armored columns, operating with mixed sensor capabilities and frequently lacking functional thermal optics due to maintenance failures or equipment age, found themselves engaged at night by enemies they could not detect. Videos from Ukrainian defense forces showed thermal imagery of Russian vehicles, bright white against cold backgrounds, being systematically engaged and destroyed during night operations. The visual aesthetic, white thermal signatures on black screens suddenly erupting in flames, directly paralleled American gun camera footage from 1991. The parallel extended to psychological effects. Russian tank crews, interviewed after capture, described experiences nearly identical to those of Iraqi crews 3 decades earlier. Combat in darkness against unseen enemies, sudden impacts from unknown directions, the terror of being hunted without sensory access to the hunter's location. The technology had proliferated and improved, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Thermal asymmetry granted categorical advantage, transforming armored combat into one-sided engagements, where the side lacking sensors died without effectively fighting back. The proliferation of thermal imaging has continued beyond state militaries. Commercial thermal optics, priced below $2,000, are now available to civilian purchasers. Consumer-grade quadcopters equipped with FLIR cameras, costing less than $10,000, fly over Ukrainian battlefields providing real-time thermal surveillance. Non-state actors and insurgent groups acquire thermal sights through gray markets and employ them in asymmetric conflicts. The Gulf War demonstrated that darkness no longer provides concealment against technologically sophisticated militaries. The 2020s are demonstrating that darkness may soon provide no concealment against anyone, that the thermal spectrum has become accessible to forces across the capability spectrum, that the fundamental military advantage of night operations has eroded. This raises unanswered questions about the future character of armored warfare. If thermal imaging becomes universal, if all combatants can see in darkness, does night regain its role as a neutral factor rather than a tactical advantage? Or does the quality gap between military-grade and commercial-grade thermal systems preserve asymmetry, where higher resolution and greater detection range continue to grant sensor-rich forces decisive edges? The integration of artificial intelligence with thermal imaging systems suggests the asymmetry may deepen rather than resolve. Modern fire control systems under development feature automated target recognition, where AI algorithms scan thermal imagery, identify vehicles by type, assess threat priority, and generate firing solutions without human input. The decision loop, the time from detection to engagement, compresses from seconds to milliseconds. Human reaction time, the last remaining advantage for forces with inferior sensors, disappears. Captain al-Hamdani's final moments, staring into blackness with his hand on a searchlight trigger he knew would doom him, may represent not the past, but a recurring future, where technological asymmetry in the sensory dimension decides who lives and who dies regardless of courage or training or tactical skill. The invisible M1 Abrams was not actually invisible. It was simply fighting in a dimension Iraqi tankers could not access, operating in the thermal spectrum with sensors that converted night into perfect clarity while their opponents remained blind. This was not science fiction. It was the cold logic of asymmetric sensor warfare, where information dominance determined survival. The American tanks did not need to hide. They needed only to see first, shoot first, and return to the darkness that, for them, was not dark at all. Captain Rashid al-Hamdani's final decision, the choice between dying blind or dying seen, encapsulated the helplessness of confronting technologically superior enemies. The tactical dilemma was actually an existential trap. Both options ended the same way, in fire and fragmentation and darkness that never lifted. The 1991 Gulf War was the last time a modern military enjoyed total sensory dominance against an opponent trapped in the previous generation's technology. Today, as thermal imaging proliferates to non-state actors through commercial markets, as consumer drones equipped with FLIR cameras cost less than a used car, as artificial intelligence begins automating target recognition in thermal imagery, the battlefield is transforming again. The question is no longer whether you can see in the dark. The question is whether darkness provides any concealment at all, whether the electromagnetic spectrum has been so thoroughly mapped and exploited that hiding has become physically impossible, whether warfare has entered a phase where information dominance is absolute, and the side with inferior sensors does not fight a disadvantaged battle, but simply dies. How many contemporary conflicts are decided not by strategy or valor, but by sensor asymmetry, by one side seeing clearly while the other operates in perceptual darkness? As thermal imaging moves from military monopoly to commercial commodity, are we approaching an era where darkness offers no sanctuary to anyone, where every object above ambient temperature glows like a beacon to anyone with $2,000 to spend on optics, and when artificial intelligence removes human reaction time from the engagement sequence, when computer vision scans thermal imagery and fires weapons autonomously faster than human nervous systems can process threat, what happens to the last human advantage in combat, the ability to observe and decide and act with unpredictable creativity? The lesson from Baghdad's desert in 1991 is not that technology wins wars. Every era learns that lesson anew. The lesson is that information dominance determines who survives and who dies in the dark, that seeing the enemy before they see you has always been the fundamental advantage in combat, and that technology, which grants sensory access while denying it to opponents, is more decisive than firepower or armor or numbers. In warfare's future, there may be no darkness left to hide in. The thermal spectrum, the electromagnetic realm where all warm objects betray their presence to passive sensors, has been weaponized. And unlike the visible spectrum where darkness still provides cover, the thermal spectrum cannot be extinguished. As long as an object emits heat, it glows. As long as it glows, it can be seen. And as long as it can be seen, it can be killed. The M1 Abrams stalking through the Kuwaiti night in 1991, its thermal sights painting Iraqi tanks in perfect clarity against the freezing desert, was not the end of a technological evolution. It was the beginning of a new era where invisibility belongs only to those who can master not just darkness but the physics of detection itself, where survival requires not courage or firepower, but the ability to control what the enemy's sensors can perceive. If this deep dive into the Cold War's final technological lesson revealed something you hadn't considered, something that changes how you understand modern combat, hit subscribe. Next time, how a single Soviet defector handed NATO the keys to countering every Warsaw Pact tank, and Moscow never knew until it was too late. If this investigation into how thermal imaging changed warfare forever revealed something that shifted your understanding of modern combat, subscribe to the channel. You'll get deep dives into the covert operations, intelligence failures, and technological revolutions that rewrote military history while the world wasn't watching. Hit the like button if you want more stories about the invisible wars fought in the electromagnetic spectrum. And drop a comment below. What other Cold War technology gap do you want explored? Next time, we reveal how a single Soviet defector handed NATO the blueprints to defeat every Warsaw Pact tank, and Moscow never knew until the shooting started.